The ivory lace felt cold against my fingertips as I stood frozen in the doorway of Magnolia Bridal Boutique, watching my own mother haggle over the price of my wedding dress. 6 weeks before my wedding, and there she was, Patricia Hartwell, explaining to the boutique owner why this particular gown deserved top dollar. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The pearls that had taken me months to save for caught the afternoon light as she held it up, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just fabric and thread. This was supposed to be the dress I'd wear when I married Brandon, the dress I'd dreamed about since I was 16. The dress that represented everything I'd fought to build after years of her tearing down every dream I'd ever shared with her. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known as she counted those bills with satisfaction, was that 3 days earlier, I'd walked out of Pine Street law offices with papers that would change everything. The Victorian estate she'd called home for 37 years, the house she'd inherited from my grandmother and treated like her personal kingdom, no longer belonged to her. I'd sold it. Every brick, every rose bush, every crystal chandelier that she'd polished with such pride. The $480,000 was already sitting in my lawyer's trust account. Payment for a legal battle that had consumed the last 8 months of my life. She thought she was stealing my future, but I'd already reclaimed my past. The morning that started this whole mess began like any other Tuesday in Cedar Falls, Oregon. I was sitting at my kitchen table, laptop open, trying to balance my wedding budget spreadsheet with my actual bank account, when my phone rang. Carmen Delgado, my wedding planner, never called this early unless something was wrong. "Zoe, honey, I need you to sit down." Carmen's voice carried that careful tone people use when they're about to shatter your world. "I just got a call from Magnolia Bridal. They said someone came in yesterday claiming to be you, said there was a family emergency and you needed to sell your dress immediately." The coffee mug slipped from my hands, ceramic shattering against the hardwood floor of my small apartment. The dress was supposed to be safely hanging in the boutique's climate-controlled storage, waiting for my final fitting next week. I'd put down a deposit 6 months ago, made payments every month since, dreaming of the moment I'd walk down the aisle wearing something that made me feel like the woman I'd fought so hard to become. "That's impossible," I whispered, but even as the words left my mouth, a cold certainty was settling in my stomach. There was only one person who knew about the dress, who knew where it was stored, who had enough information to convince a boutique owner that she had the right to take it. Carmen's silence stretched long enough for me to understand. "Zoe, the description they gave me, it matches your mother perfectly, down to that emerald ring she always wears." I closed my eyes and let the weight of betrayal wash over me. This wasn't the first time Patricia had stolen something precious from me, but somehow, I'd foolishly believed my wedding dress would be sacred, untouchable. I'd been naive enough to think that even she wouldn't cross this particular line. The drive to Magnolia Bridal took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Each red light gave me more time to remember, more time to piece together the pattern I'd spent years trying to ignore. When I was 17, she'd withdrawn money from my college fund to pay for a kitchen renovation, telling me education was wasted on someone who'd probably just get married anyway. When I was 22 and finally saved enough to move out, she'd called my landlord with false references, sabotaging my lease application. When I was 25 and got promoted to junior architect at my firm, she'd told everyone at our family gathering that I was still just fetching coffee for the real designers. But this felt different. This was my wedding dress, the symbol of a life I was building with Brandon, a future that had nothing to do with her endless need to control and diminish everything I touched. Natalie Kim, the boutique owner, met me at the door with apologetic eyes and wringing hands. She was a small woman with silver hair and the kind of gentle demeanor that made brides feel safe, entrusting their most important purchase to her care. "Zoe, I'm so sorry." She had all the right information, knew your size, knew the exact modifications we'd discussed. She even knew about the pearl detail you'd added to the sleeve. She said you were in the hospital, that the wedding was postponed indefinitely, and that selling the dress was the only way to pay the medical bills. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "How much did you give her?" $3,000. It was worth more, but she seemed desperate and I thought I was helping. Natalie's face crumpled, I should have called you first. I should have verified. This has never happened before in 20 years of business. $3,000. The same amount I'd paid for the dress. The same amount I'd saved over 6 months by bringing lunch to work every day and skipping dinners out with friends. Money that was now in my mother's pocket, probably already spent on whatever she'd decided was more important than my happiness. I thanked Natalie and walked back to my car on unsteady legs. Sitting in the parking lot, I called Brandon, my fingers shaking as I dialed his number. She sold my dress, I said when he answered, not bothering with hello. My mother actually sold my wedding dress. The silence on Brandon's end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with controlled anger. Where are you right now? The bridal shop parking lot. Stay there. I'm coming to get you. Brandon arrived 15 minutes later, his usually calm face stormy with an emotion I'd rarely seen from him. He was the kind of man who solved problems with logic and patience, who'd spent the last 3 years helping me untangle the psychological knots my mother had tied around my sense of self-worth. But this seemed to have crossed a line even for him. He pulled me into his arms right there in the parking lot, and for the first time since Carmen's call, I let myself cry. Not the angry tears I'd expected, but something deeper, older. Grief for the mother I'd always wanted but never had. Grief for the relationship that had been poisoned by her need to control and diminish everything I loved. We're going to fix this, Brandon said against my hair. I don't know how yet, but we're going to fix this. We drove to his apartment in silence, my mind racing through possibilities. I could call her, demand she give the money back, threaten to cut her out of the wedding entirely. But I knew Patricia well enough to know that confrontation would only escalate things. She'd deny it, claim I was being dramatic, maybe even suggest that I was having a breakdown from wedding stress. That's how these things always went with her. Reality became negotiable when it didn't serve her narrative. Brandon made tea while I sat on his couch, staring at the engagement photo on his mantle. We looked so happy in that picture, so certain that love would be enough to overcome anything. I wondered if other couples had to navigate this kind of betrayal from family, if other brides spent their engagement trying to protect their joy from the people who should have been celebrating with them. I need to tell you something, I said when Brandon handed me the steaming mug. Something I've been putting off because I was afraid it would make everything worse. He sat beside me, patient as always, waiting for me to find the words. 8 months ago, I hired a lawyer, Diane Russo, downtown. I've been building a case against my mother for financial fraud. Brandon's eyebrows rose, but he didn't interrupt. You remember when my grandmother died 3 years ago? She left me half of everything in her will. The house, the investments, even her jewelry collection. But my mother convinced me to let her handle the estate. Said it would be easier if everything went through her, since she was the older daughter. I was grieving, and I trusted her. The words tasted bitter as I spoke them. I never saw a penny of that inheritance. She claimed the estate was worth less than expected, that most of it went to pay off debts I didn't know existed. But last year, when I was helping her with her tax paperwork, I found documents that showed the real value of what my grandmother left behind. Nearly $800,000, Brandon. She kept all of it. Brandon set down his tea with careful control. $800,000? The house alone was appraised at $480,000. She's been living there rent-free, paying the taxes with money that should have been split between us. When I confronted her about it, she told me I was being greedy, that family doesn't keep score, that I should be grateful she'd taken care of all the complicated legal stuff so I didn't have to worry about it. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos I'd taken of the documents. Bank statements, property deeds, investment accounts, all in her name, all funded with money that legally belonged to both of us. Diane says we have a solid case. Fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, maybe even theft. The statute of limitations hasn't run out, because I only discovered the deception last year. But pursuing it means... I took a shaky breath. It means war. With my own mother. 6 weeks before our wedding. Brandon was quiet for a long time, studying the documents on my phone screen. When he finally looked up, his expression was resolved. The dress, he said slowly. She didn't just steal your dress. She stole it because she knows you're fighting back. This is her way of hitting you where it hurts most, right when you're most vulnerable. The truth of it hit me like cold water. Patricia had always been strategic in her cruelty, always known exactly how to find the pressure points that would cause maximum damage. Selling my wedding dress wasn't about the money. $3,000 was nothing to her. This was about control, about reminding me that she could reach into any corner of my life and take whatever she wanted. What did your lawyer say about the case? That we could recover everything, plus damages, but it would take time, and it would get ugly. She'd fight it, probably drag it through the courts for months. Diane warned me that family lawsuits are always the nastiest ones, because both sides know exactly where to aim to cause the most pain. Brandon nodded slowly. And now she's proven that point. We spent the rest of the afternoon researching options. I called 3 more bridal shops, hoping to find something similar to my stolen dress. But with 6 weeks until the wedding, the chances of finding anything close were slim. The dresses that were available in my size were either completely wrong or would cost twice what I'd already lost.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
That evening, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in Brandon's bedroom, trying to imagine walking down the aisle in some hastily purchased backup dress, knowing that my mother was probably at home, satisfied with the chaos she'd created. The thought made my stomach burn with an anger I'd been suppressing for years. I picked up my phone and called Diane Russo. "Zoe? It's pretty late. Is everything okay?" "She escalated," I said without preamble. "My mother. She sold my wedding dress today." Diane was quiet for a moment. "Tell me everything." I laid out the day's events, my voice getting steadier as I spoke. By the time I finished, I felt clearer than I had in months. "Here's what I want to do," I said. "I want to file for immediate recovery of my inheritance. All of it. And I want to use whatever legal tools we have to make this happen fast." "Zoe, that's a significant escalation. Are you sure you're ready for what that means?" I thought about my dress hanging in someone else's closet, about the years of small and large thefts, about the way Patricia had trained me to accept less than I deserved, because fighting back was too exhausting. "I'm done being stolen from," I said. "She wants to play games with my wedding? Fine. But she's going to learn that I'm not that scared little girl anymore." Diane's voice carried a note of professional satisfaction. "In that case, let's talk strategy. I'll file the paperwork tomorrow morning. Given the proximity to your wedding and the recent theft, I think we can make a compelling case for expedited proceedings." After I hung up, Brandon found me standing on his balcony, looking out at the city lights of Cedar Falls. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the smell of wood smoke and dying leaves. "You know she's going to fight dirty," he said, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "Good," I replied, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "I'm ready for a fight." What I didn't know then was that Patricia had been preparing for war long before I'd found the courage to pick up a weapon. What I didn't know was that selling my dress was just the opening move in a game she'd been planning for months. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let her play alone. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from my mother. I let them all go to voicemail, knowing that whatever she had to say would be a masterclass in manipulation disguised as concern. Instead, I drove straight to Pine Street law offices, where Diane was already waiting with a stack of paperwork and a look of grim determination. "I've been thinking about this all night," she said as I sat down across from her desk. "The theft of your dress actually strengthens our case significantly. It shows a pattern of taking your property without permission, which supports our argument that she's been doing the same thing with your inheritance." She spread out documents across the desk, official-looking papers, with lots of stamps and signatures. "I'm filing for immediate injunctive relief. That means we're asking the court to freeze all assets related to your grandmother's estate until we can sort out who owns what. The house, the investment accounts, everything." I stared at the papers, my heart pounding. What does that mean for her? It means she won't be able to sell the house, access the investment funds, or make any major financial decisions without court approval. Effectively, it means she'll lose control of assets she's been treating as her own for 3 years. The magnitude of what I was about to do settled over me like a heavy blanket. I was essentially freezing my mother's entire financial life, forcing her into a legal battle that would expose years of deception to public scrutiny. "Diane," I said slowly, "what are the chances we actually win this?" Her smile was sharp and confident. "With the documentation you've provided, I'd say 90%. Your grandmother's will is clear. The financial records show exactly what happened to your inheritance. And your mother's own tax returns prove she's been benefiting from money that legally belongs to you. The only question is how long she'll drag it out, and how much damage she'll try to do along the way." I signed every paper she put in front of me, my hands steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. With each signature, I was crossing a line I'd never be able to uncross, burning a bridge I'd spent 30 years trying to repair. But as I wrote my name for the final time, I thought about my wedding dress hanging in some stranger's closet, and I felt nothing but resolve. By noon, the papers were filed. By 3 o'clock, Patricia's lawyer had called Diane, demanding to know what grounds we had for such an aggressive legal action. By 5 o'clock, my mother was standing on Brandon's doorstep, her face a mask of wounded innocence and righteous indignation. I watched her through the peephole, noting the way she'd dressed for maximum sympathy. No makeup, hair slightly disheveled, wearing the cardigan I'd given her last Christmas. She looked like a woman who'd been blindsided by an ungrateful daughter's betrayal, not someone who'd spent years systematically stealing from her own child. "Zoe, honey, please open the door. We need to talk about this misunderstanding." I almost laughed at the word misunderstanding, as if accidentally selling someone's wedding dress was the kind of innocent mistake that happened to well-meaning mothers everywhere. Brandon stood beside me, his presence steady and calm. "You don't have to talk to her if you don't want to." "Actually," I said, surprising myself, "I think I do." I opened the door and stepped onto the porch, closing it behind me so she couldn't push her way inside. Patricia's face immediately shifted from wounded to calculating, her eyes scanning me for weakness. "Sweetheart, I don't understand what's happening. I got served with papers today claiming I've stolen from you. This is all some terrible mistake." "Where's my dress, Mom?" She blinked, momentarily thrown by the directness of the question. "Your dress?" "Honey, I don't know what you're talking about." "My wedding dress. The one you sold to Magnolia Bridal yesterday for $3,000. The one you claimed you had a right to sell because I was in the hospital." Patricia's face went through a series of micro-expressions, confusion, anger, and calculation, before settling on hurt bewilderment. It was a masterful performance, and if I hadn't spent 30 years learning to read her tells, I might have almost believed it. "Zoe, I would never. How could you even think I would do something like that?" "Because you did it. Natalie Kim described you perfectly, down to the emerald ring you're wearing right now." Patricia glanced down at her hand as if she'd forgotten about the ring, then looked back up with tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Someone must have impersonated me. This is identity theft, honey. We should call the police." The sheer audacity of it took my breath away. Even caught red-handed, she was still lying, still trying to twist reality to serve her narrative. "Mom, stop. Just stop. I know you sold my dress. I know you've been living in a house that legally belongs to both of us. I know you've been spending money from investments that my grandmother left to me. I have bank records, tax documents, everything." For just a moment, Patricia's mask slipped, and I saw something cold and calculating flash across her features. Then it was gone, replaced by wounded motherly concern. "Zoe, honey, you're stressed about the wedding. You're not thinking clearly. This lawyer, this Diane person, she's filled your head with lies to try to get money out of our family. Can't you see that? The only person who's been lying is you." Patricia stepped closer, her voice dropping to the tone she'd used when I was a child, and she was trying to convince me that black was white, that my memory was faulty, that my reality wasn't real. "Listen to me, sweetheart. Your grandmother's estate was complicated. There were debts, taxes, legal fees. I've been protecting you from all of that stress, handling everything so you could focus on building your life. And this is how you repay me? By suing your own mother?" I felt the familiar tug of doubt. The old programming that told me maybe I was wrong, maybe I was being ungrateful, maybe she really had been trying to help. But then, I thought about my dress, about the satisfaction in her eyes as she'd counted those bills, and the doubt evaporated. If that's true, then you'll have no problem providing documentation for all those debts and fees. You'll have no problem with a judge reviewing how you've managed the estate. You'll have no problem proving that everything you've done has been legal, and in my best interest. Patricia's face hardened. I see what this is really about. You're marrying that boy, and suddenly you think you're too good for your own family. You think you can just discard the woman who raised you, who sacrificed everything for you. I think I can stop letting you steal from me. Steal? She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. I gave you everything. I put a roof over your head, food on your table, clothes on your back. Everything I had went to making sure you had opportunities I never had, and now you want to nickel and dime me over some paperwork? $300,000 isn't nickels and dimes, Mom. The number hung in the air between us like a weapon. Patricia's eyes went very still, and I realized she hadn't known exactly how much I'd figured out. You have no idea what you're talking about, she said quietly. And if you pursue this ridiculous lawsuit, you're going to destroy this family. Is that really what you want? To air our private business in court? To humiliate your own mother in front of strangers? You humiliated yourself when you decided to steal from your own daughter. Patricia stared at me for a long moment, and I saw her recalculating, recognizing that the old tactics weren't working. When she spoke again, her voice carried a threat, barely disguised as concern. I hope you know what you're doing, Zoe. I hope you're prepared for what happens when you try to destroy the only family you have. Because once you go down this road, there's no coming back. And when that boy realizes what kind of person he's marrying, someone who would sue her own mother, don't come crying to me. She turned and walked away, her posture straight and dignified, playing the role of the wronged mother to the end. But I'd seen the flash of something dangerous in her eyes, and I knew this was far from over. Brandon found me still standing on the porch 10 minutes later, staring at the spot where she'd been. How do you feel? He asked gently. I thought about it, taking inventory of the emotions swirling through me. Scared, angry, sad, but underneath it all, something I hadn't felt in years when it came to my relationship with my mother. Free, I said, and meant it. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of legal documents and sleepless nights. Diane had warned me that Patricia would escalate once she realized the court case was serious, but I hadn't been prepared for the sheer creativity of her retaliation. It started small, petty things that could almost be dismissed as coincidence. My credit card was mysteriously canceled due to suspicious activity that turned out to be Patricia calling to report it stolen. My car insurance was dropped when someone claiming to be me called to cancel the policy. My gym membership, my phone service, even my subscription to the local newspaper, all mysteriously terminated by a woman who knew every detail of my personal information. But Patricia's real masterstroke came on a Thursday morning when I arrived at work to find my boss, Helen Crawford, waiting for me with an expression of uncomfortable concern. Helen was a fair woman in her 50s who'd been running Crawford Architecture for nearly 2 decades, and in the 3 years I'd worked for her, I'd never seen her look so unsettled. Zoe, I need to speak with you privately, she said, gesturing toward her glass-walled office. My stomach dropped as I followed her, noting the way my coworker's eyes tracked our movement with barely concealed curiosity. Helen closed the door and gestured for me to sit, but remained standing herself, arms crossed in a posture that spoke of damage control rather than support. I received a very disturbing phone call yesterday, she began, her voice carefully neutral. A woman claiming to be your mother called to inform me that you've been struggling with some personal issues. She seemed very concerned about your mental health and your ability to handle the stress of your current projects. The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the arms of my chair, feeling the familiar sensation of Patricia's invisible hands, reshaping my reality from a distance. Helen, I can explain. She mentioned that you've been having paranoid delusions about family members stealing from you, that you've filed frivolous lawsuits, and that you might be having some kind of breakdown related to wedding stress. Helen's tone was sympathetic but firm. She suggested that perhaps you needed some time off to get the help you need. I stared at Helen, watching years of professional credibility crumble in real time. Patricia had found the perfect weapon, the one thing guaranteed to undermine everything I'd built at Crawford Architecture. In a profession where client trust and mental stability were paramount, even the suggestion of psychological instability could be career-ending. Helen, none of that is true. My mother, she's the one who's been stealing from me. I have documentation, legal proof. The lawsuit isn't frivolous, it's necessary. Helen's expression softened slightly, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. Zoe, I've known you for 3 years. You're one of my most reliable architects. But this woman sounded genuinely worried about you, and some of the things she described. She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. What things? She said you've been obsessing over imaginary financial crimes, that you've become paranoid and suspicious of everyone around you. She mentioned that you accused her of stealing your wedding dress, of all things, and that you've been harassing local businesses with false claims. The brilliance of it was breathtaking in its cruelty. Patricia had taken the truth of her own actions and reframed them as evidence of my mental instability. In her version, I wasn't the victim of theft and fraud. I was a delusional woman spiraling into paranoia and making false accusations against my loving, concerned mother. Helen, I can prove everything I've told you. My lawyer has bank records, estate documents, even security footage from the bridal shop. Zoe. Helen sat down across from me, her expression pained. I want to believe you. But I also have to consider the possibility that you're under more stress than you realize. Planning a wedding, dealing with family conflict, it's a lot for anyone to handle. I felt the walls closing in, the familiar suffocation of having my reality questioned by someone whose opinion mattered. This was Patricia's greatest skill, her ability to plant seeds of doubt so effectively that even people who knew me well began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I was the problem. I'm not having a breakdown, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest. I'm having a breakthrough. For the first time in my life, I'm standing up to someone who's been manipulating and stealing from me for years. Helen nodded slowly, but I could see she wasn't entirely convinced. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you 2 weeks of paid leave. Use that time to sort out whatever's happening with your family, get whatever help you need, and then come back when you're ready to focus fully on work. It wasn't a firing, but it wasn't far from one either. 2 weeks of forced leave in the middle of my biggest project, with the clear implication that my mental state was suspect. Patricia had managed to poison my professional life without even setting foot in the building. I gathered my things in a daze, ignoring the curious stares of my colleagues as I packed my laptop and personal items into a box. 3 years of building professional credibility, undone with a single phone call from a woman who knew exactly which buttons to push. Brandon was waiting for me in the parking lot when I finally made it outside. I'd called him from the elevator, my voice barely above a whisper as I explained what had happened. She called my boss, I said, as I slumped into his passenger seat. She convinced Helen that I'm having a mental breakdown. She made me sound like a paranoid lunatic who's making false accusations against my poor, worried mother. Brandon's jaw tightened as he pulled out of the parking lot. What did Helen say exactly? I recounted the conversation, watching Brandon's expression grow darker with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. We're going to Diane's office, he said finally. Right now. This crosses every line there is. Diane Russo looked up from her computer as we burst into her office, her expression immediately shifting to high alert when she saw our faces. What happened? I explained about the phone call to my boss, about Patricia's systematic campaign to undermine my credibility and reputation. Diane listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. This is harassment, she said when I finished. Intentional interference with employment, defamation, possibly even a form of stalking. We can add it to the lawsuit. But will anyone believe me? I asked. She's made it sound like I'm the one who's unstable, like I'm making everything up. Diane's smile was sharp and predatory. Actually, this might be the best thing that could have happened to our case. Your mother just gave us a clear pattern of retaliatory behavior. The timing is perfect, right after we filed the injunction. Any reasonable person will see this for what it is. She pulled out a thick folder and spread documents across her desk. I've been building a timeline of your mother's actions since we filed the paperwork. The credit card cancellation, the insurance issues, now this call to your employer. It's textbook retaliation, and it's going to make our case much stronger. I stared at the documents, evidence of Patricia's systematic campaign to destabilize my life. How is this legal? How can she just call my boss and lie about me? Technically, it's not legal. Defamation, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress. We can pursue all of those. But more importantly for our immediate case, it shows the court exactly who we're dealing with. This isn't a grief-stricken mother trying to protect family assets. This is someone who's willing to destroy her own daughter's life to avoid accountability. Diane pulled out another set of papers, official-looking documents with court seals. I've got more good news. The court granted our motion for expedited proceedings. We're going to have a hearing next week to determine temporary custody of the estate assets. My heart stuttered. Next week? That fast? The judge was apparently very interested in our documentation, especially the evidence of ongoing financial manipulation. Plus, your mother's lawyer made some strategic errors in their response that suggest they're not as confident in their position as they'd like us to believe. She handed me a copy of Patricia's legal response, and I scanned the pages with growing amazement. It was a masterclass in deflection and misdirection, full of emotional appeals about ungrateful children and family loyalty, but notably short on actual legal arguments or evidence. She's claiming that you're mentally unstable and being manipulated by me, Diane continued, that you're having a breakdown and making false accusations. Sound familiar? I nodded grimly. It's her favorite tactic. Make everyone doubt my version of reality. Well, it's about to backfire spectacularly, because now we have documented evidence of her using that exact same tactic to retaliate against you professionally. The court is going to see right through it. Brandon leaned forward in his chair. What do we need to do to prepare for this hearing? Mostly just stay calm and let me handle the legal arguments. But Zoe, I need you to be prepared for what your mother might say in court. She's going to paint you as an unstable, ungrateful daughter who's been manipulated by greedy lawyers. She might bring up every mistake you've ever made, every moment of vulnerability you've ever shown her. I thought about that, about the years of small cruelties and large betrayals that Patricia would undoubtedly weaponize in court. The time I'd struggled with depression in college, and she'd told everyone I was fragile. The brief period when I'd lived at home after a bad breakup, and she'd used it as evidence that I couldn't handle adult responsibilities. Every confidence I'd ever shared with her, every moment of weakness, would become ammunition. I'm ready, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. I've been getting ready for this my whole life. The weekend before the hearing, I did something I'd been avoiding for months. I drove to the Hartwell family estate, the Victorian house that had been my grandmother's pride and joy, to see it one more time before everything changed. The house sat on 2 acres of carefully maintained grounds in the oldest part of Cedar Falls, a monument to turn-of-the-century craftsmanship and old-money elegance. I'd grown up spending summers here, learning to bake in my grandmother's kitchen, reading in the library with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, dreaming in the tower room that overlooked the rose garden. Patricia's car was in the driveway, but I didn't care. I had as much right to be here as she did, maybe more. I walked around to the back garden, where my grandmother's roses were still blooming despite the autumn chill. I wondered when you'd show up here. I turned to find Patricia standing on the back porch, dressed in gardening clothes, her hands dirty with soil. She looked older than I remembered, more fragile, and for a moment I felt a pang of something that might have been guilt. I wanted to see the garden one more time, I said simply. Patricia walked down the steps slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. Your grandmother planted these roses when your grandfather was deployed in Korea. She said they were a promise that beautiful things could survive even when everything else was falling apart. I recognized the manipulation immediately. Patricia had always been skilled at using my grandmother's memory as a weapon. invoking her wisdom and love whenever she needed to make me feel guilty for standing up for myself. Grandma Rose would be ashamed of what you've done with her legacy, I said quietly. Patricia's face hardened. Your grandmother would be heartbroken to see what you've become. A daughter who would destroy her own family over money. This isn't about money. This is about truth. This is about you finally being held accountable for years of lies and theft. Theft? Patricia laughed bitterly. I've spent 3 years maintaining this house, paying the taxes, dealing with repairs and upkeep. I've preserved your grandmother's legacy while you were off playing house with your boyfriend. And this is how you repay me? I stared at her, marveling at her ability to reframe every situation as evidence of her own victimhood. You've been living here rent-free, using money that legally belongs to both of us. That's not preservation, that's theft. I've been protecting this family's assets from a daughter who would probably sell everything to pay for some overpriced wedding. The irony was stunning. You're the one who sold something for my wedding. My dress. My grandmother's ring is probably next, isn't it? Patricia's face went very still. And I realized I'd struck closer to the truth than I'd intended. Your grandmother's ring is safe. Where? Show me. I don't have to prove anything to you. Not anymore. We stared at each other across the rose garden, two women shaped by the same family but walking completely different paths. I saw myself in her features, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way her hands clenched when she was angry. But I also saw the differences, the hardness in her eyes that I refused to let take root in my own. You're going to lose, I said, not with malice but with certainty. In court, in this house, in our relationship, you're going to lose everything because you couldn't stop taking what wasn't yours. Patricia smiled then, a cold expression that didn't reach her eyes. We'll see about that. You think you know what you're up against, but you have no idea what I'm capable of when someone threatens my family. I'm not threatening your family. I am your family. Not anymore, she said softly. The moment you filed those papers, you stopped being my daughter. You became my enemy. I walked away then, leaving her standing among the roses my grandmother had planted as a symbol of hope and endurance. As I drove away from the house, I realized I wasn't sad about leaving it behind. The building itself was just brick and mortar. The real legacy my grandmother had left me wasn't a place but a choice. The choice to stand up for what was right, even when it cost everything. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, staring at the folder of evidence Diane had prepared. Bank statements, property deeds, tax returns. A paper trail that told the story of 3 years of systematic deception. But beyond the legal documents, I thought about the deeper story, the one that couldn't be captured in court filings. The story of a daughter who'd spent 30 years trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it freely. The story of a woman who'd confused control with care, manipulation with protection. Brandon found me there at 2 a.m, still staring at papers that had long since blurred together. Having second thoughts? He asked gently, settling into the chair across from me. No, I said, surprising myself with the firmness of the answer. I'm thinking about what comes after. Even if we win, even if I get back every penny she stole, what then? She's still my mother. She'll still be the woman who raised me, who knows every insecurity I've ever had, who can hurt me in ways no stranger ever could. Brandon reached across the table and took my hand. What do you want to happen? I thought about that for a long moment. I want her to admit what she did. I want her to acknowledge that she was wrong, that she hurt me, that she used my love for her as a weapon against me. I want an apology that means something. And if she doesn't give you that, then I'll know I tried everything. And I'll know that the problem was never me. Brandon squeezed my hand. Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm proud of you. 3 months ago, you wouldn't have even considered standing up to her. Now look at you. I looked down at our joined hands, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The scared woman who'd accepted her mother's version of reality, who'd believed she deserved less than she was worth, felt like a stranger now. I keep thinking about my wedding dress, I said. Not because I'm upset about the dress itself, but because of what it represented. She took something that was supposed to be the beginning of my new life and tried to turn it into another way to control me. But instead, it was the thing that finally made me fight back. Sometimes, the worst thing someone does to you ends up being the best thing that could have happened. I nodded, understanding the truth of that in a way I hadn't before. Patricia's theft of my dress hadn't just been a betrayal. It had been a liberation. It had finally given me permission to stop protecting someone who had never protected me. The courthouse in downtown Cedar Falls was an imposing brick building that had been standing since the 1920s, its marble halls echoing with decades of legal dramas and life-changing decisions. I walked through the metal detectors with Diane at my side, my heels clicking against the polished floor with a confidence I didn't entirely feel. Patricia was already there when we entered the courtroom, sitting at the defendant's table with her lawyer, a thin man in an expensive suit who looked like he specialized in making the guilty look innocent. She was dressed impeccably, her gray hair styled perfectly, wearing the navy suit she reserved for important occasions. She looked like exactly what she was trying to appear to be, a respectable woman wronged by an unstable daughter. But when she turned to look at me, I saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Fear. Real, genuine fear. That maybe, for the first time in her life, her manipulations weren't going to work. Judge Morrison was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair, and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd seen every trick in the book. She reviewed the case files with methodical precision before looking up at both tables. This is a hearing to determine temporary custody of assets related to the estate of Rose Margaret Hartwell, deceased. The plaintiff alleges fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. The defendant claims the plaintiff is mentally unstable and making false accusations. Let's start with the plaintiff's case. Diane stood with the fluid grace of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. She laid out our case with surgical precision, walking the judge through the timeline of my grandmother's death, the terms of the will, and the subsequent management of the estate by Patricia. Your Honor, the evidence shows a clear pattern of financial manipulation and fraud. The defendant has been living in property that legally belongs to both parties, while using funds from the estate to maintain a lifestyle she couldn't otherwise afford. When the plaintiff discovered these irregularities and began legal proceedings, the defendant escalated to harassment and defamation, including interfering with the plaintiff's employment. Diane presented document after document, bank statements showing Patricia's exclusive access to estate funds, property tax records indicating she'd been paying with inherited money, even the sales receipt from my wedding dress, obtained through a subpoena of the bridal shop's records. This is not a family dispute, Your Honor. This is a clear case of financial fraud committed against a victim who happened to be the perpetrator's own daughter. Patricia's lawyer stood to present their defense, and I braced myself for the character assassination I knew was coming. Your Honor, my client is a grieving mother who has spent 3 years managing a complex estate while trying to protect her unstable daughter from financial responsibilities she couldn't handle. The plaintiff has a history of mental health issues, relationship problems, and poor financial decisions. These allegations are the product of a troubled mind being manipulated by opportunistic legal counsel. He painted a picture of me as an unstable woman having a breakdown, unable to cope with the stress of wedding planning and adult responsibilities. He suggested that my accusations were delusional, that I was imagining conspiracies where none existed. But when Judge Morrison asked for evidence to support these claims, Patricia's lawyer had nothing concrete to offer. No medical records, no documentation of mental health treatment, no witnesses to my alleged instability beyond Patricia's own testimony. Your Honor, Diane said when it was her turn to respond, the defendant's entire case rests on character assassination and unsupported claims about the plaintiff's mental state. Yet they offer no explanation for where $300,000 in estate funds have gone, no documentation for the alleged debts and expenses they claim justified keeping the plaintiff's inheritance. Judge Morrison studied the documents in front of her for what felt like an eternity. When she finally looked up, her expression was stern and decisive. I've reviewed all the evidence presented by both parties. The financial documentation provided by the plaintiff is comprehensive and compelling. The defendant's claims about the plaintiff's mental state appear to be unsupported by any credible evidence and seem designed to deflect from legitimate questions about estate management. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the entire courtroom could hear it. Therefore, I'm granting the plaintiff's motion for temporary injunctive relief. All assets related to the Rose Margaret Hartwell estate are hereby frozen pending a full trial on the merits. The defendant is ordered to provide a complete accounting of all estate funds and transactions within 30 days. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. I had won the first battle. Patricia's face went white as the implications sank in. The house, the investment accounts, everything she'd been treating as her personal property was now under court control. She couldn't sell, couldn't spend, couldn't make any major financial decisions without judicial approval. But as we gathered our papers and prepared to leave, Patricia caught my arm as I passed her table. "This isn't over," she whispered, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "You think you've won something, but you have no idea what you've just unleashed. I will destroy you before I let you destroy me." I looked into her eyes and saw something that chilled me to the bone. Not the manipulative mother I'd grown up with, but something darker, more desperate. A woman who'd built her entire identity on control and was watching it crumble in real time. "You already tried to destroy me," I whispered back. "The difference is, I'm not going to let you." As I walked out of that courtroom, I realized the real battle was just beginning. The victory celebration lasted exactly 12 hours. Brandon and I had gone to dinner at Riverside Bistro, the same restaurant where he'd proposed 2 years earlier, and for a few precious hours I allowed myself to believe that the worst was behind us. We talked about wedding plans, about finding a new dress, about the future we were building together. The court's decision felt like vindication, like proof that truth could actually triumph over manipulation. I should have known Patricia wouldn't accept defeat gracefully. I woke up the next morning to find my apartment door ajar. Not wide open, just cracked enough to suggest that someone had either left in a hurry or wanted me to notice the intrusion immediately. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pushed the door open wider, calling out tentatively to see if anyone was still inside. The silence that answered was somehow more terrifying than any response would have been. My apartment had been searched, methodically and thoroughly. Drawers pulled out, cushions moved, papers scattered across every surface. But this wasn't a random burglary. Nothing valuable was missing. Not my laptop, not my grandmother's jewelry that I kept in a small safe, not even the cash I kept in my kitchen drawer for emergencies. This was something far more targeted and infinitely more personal. My wedding planning binder was gone. The thick folder where I'd kept every detail of our upcoming ceremony, every contract, every vendor contact, every carefully planned element of what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Also missing were my personal photo albums, the ones with pictures of my grandmother and me, family holidays, childhood memories that couldn't be replaced. But the most chilling discovery was what had been left behind. Scattered across my coffee table were dozens of printed emails, text messages, and social media posts, all taken from my private accounts. Messages between Brandon and me discussing my mother's behavior. Conversations with friends where I'd vented about family drama. Even therapy session notes from the brief period when I'd tried counseling to deal with my complicated relationship with Patricia. In the center of it all was a handwritten note in Patricia's precise script. "Everyone should know who you really are." I called the police first, then Diane, then Brandon. The responding officer was a young man who seemed more interested in getting through his paperwork than investigating what was clearly a personal vendetta. He dutifully noted the missing items and the evidence of intrusion, but when I tried to explain about the ongoing legal case and my mother's pattern of retaliation, his eyes glazed over with the look of someone who'd already decided this was a family dispute rather than a real crime. "Ma'am, unless you have proof that your mother was here, there's not much we can do. You said nothing valuable was stolen, so this might not even be a burglary. Maybe you left the door unlocked, maybe someone was playing a prank." I stared at him, holding up the handwritten note. This is in my mother's handwriting. She broke into my apartment and stole my personal belongings. Handwriting analysis would require a court order and a lot more evidence than this. My advice would be to change your locks and maybe consider whether there are family members who might have spare keys. He left after filling out a report that I knew would disappear into some bureaucratic void, never to be investigated or followed up on. The violation of my personal space was bad enough, but the casual dismissal of my concerns by law enforcement felt like another layer of gaslighting, another voice telling me that my reality wasn't worth taking seriously. Diane arrived 20 minutes later, her expression grim as she surveyed the chaos in my apartment. She photographed everything, documenting the scene with the methodical precision of someone who knew this would end up as evidence in court. "This is escalation," she said as she worked. "Breaking and entering, theft of personal property, harassment. We can add this to our case, but more importantly, we need to get you a restraining order immediately. Will that actually stop her?" Diane's pause was answer enough. Restraining orders are pieces of paper, Zoe. They're only as effective as the person they're meant to restrain allows them to be. But they do establish a legal record of threatening behavior, which becomes very important if things escalate further. The word escalate hung in the air, like a threat. I tried to imagine what escalation might look like beyond breaking into my apartment and stealing my most personal belongings, and found that my imagination wasn't equipped for the task. Brandon arrived as Diane was finishing her documentation, and the look on his face when he saw the destruction was something I'd never seen before. Brandon was gentle by nature, conflict-averse, the kind of man who believed that reasonable people could solve any problem through calm discussion. But as he took in the violation of our shared space, something fundamental shifted in his expression. "She was in our home," he said quietly, his voice carrying an undercurrent of fury that surprised us both. "She went through our things, our private conversations, our personal space." I nodded, suddenly feeling the full weight of what had happened. This wasn't just about me anymore. Patricia had dragged Brandon into her war, violated his privacy, threatened the sanctuary we'd built together. "What was in the wedding binder?" he asked. I tried to remember everything that had been in that folder. Vendor contracts, payment schedules, guest lists, seating charts, menu selections. Every detail of our wedding. Diane looked up from her camera. "She now has access to everyone you've hired for your wedding. Caterers, photographers, musicians, florists. She knows when and where everything is supposed to happen." The implications hit me like cold water. Patricia wasn't just stealing my things, she was positioning herself to sabotage the wedding itself. With the contracts and contact information from my binder, she could cancel services, change arrangements, create chaos on what was supposed to be the most important day of my life. I spent the rest of the morning on the phone with every vendor we'd hired, warning them that someone might try to make unauthorized changes to our arrangements. Most were understanding, if confused by the unusual request. A few were clearly skeptical, probably wondering what kind of family drama they'd inadvertently become part of. The florist, an elderly man named George who'd been arranging weddings in Cedar Falls for 40 years, was particularly concerned. "Honey, I've seen family feuds ruin more weddings than I care to count. Whatever's going on between you and your mother, maybe you should consider postponing until you can work things out." I found myself explaining the situation more than I wanted to, trying to make George understand that this wasn't a typical mother-daughter disagreement about flower choices or guest lists. But as I spoke, I could hear how it sounded from the outside. A stressed bride having conflicts with her family, exactly the kind of drama that wedding vendors learn to avoid. By noon, I'd secured verbal agreements from most of our vendors to only accept changes directly from Brandon or me, with photo identification required for any in-person modifications. But I knew that verbal agreements were fragile protection against someone as determined and manipulative as Patricia. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following week, which meant 5 more days of vulnerability, 5 more days of wondering what Patricia might do next. Diane advised me to stay with Brandon, to avoid being alone, to document any unusual activity or contact attempts. "She's trying to isolate you," Diane explained as we sat in her office later that afternoon. "Breaking into your apartment, threatening your wedding, undermining your credibility with vendors and employers. These are classic tactics used by abusers to make their victims feel powerless and alone." The word abuser stopped me cold. I'd always thought of Patricia as controlling, manipulative, difficult. But abuser felt like a different category entirely, a label that carried implications I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. I know it's hard to hear, Diane continued gently, especially when we're talking about your mother, but emotional abuse, financial abuse, the systematic undermining of your autonomy and self-worth, these are all forms of domestic violence. The fact that she's your parent doesn't make her behavior any less abusive. I thought about the years of small cruelties, the constant undermining of my confidence, the way Patricia had trained me to doubt my own perceptions and accept less than I deserved. Reframed through the lens of abuse rather than difficult family dynamics, her behavior took on a more sinister cast. The good news, Diane said, is that abusers tend to escalate in predictable ways when their control is threatened. Patricia's current behavior fits a very clear pattern, which means we can anticipate her next moves and prepare accordingly. What do you think she'll do next? Diane's expression was troubled. Based on what I've seen so far, I think she'll try to turn other people against you. Family members, friends, anyone whose opinion matters to you. She'll use the information she stole from your apartment to craft a narrative about your mental state, your relationship with Brandon, your fitness as a daughter and future wife. The prediction proved accurate sooner than either of us expected. That evening, my phone began ringing with calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. My Aunt Sarah, my cousin Michael, even my elderly Uncle Frank, all calling with versions of the same concerned message. Patricia had apparently spent the day reaching out to the extended family, sharing carefully selected excerpts from my private messages and therapy notes. She'd painted a picture of a daughter having a breakdown, making false accusations against her loving mother, being manipulated by a greedy lawyer and an unsupportive fiancé. "Zoe, sweetheart, your mother is beside herself with worry," Aunt Sarah said when I finally answered one of the calls. "She showed me some of the things you've been saying about her, and honestly, I'm concerned about your mental state. This lawsuit, these wild accusations, it's just not like you." I found myself once again in the exhausting position of defending my own reality against Patricia's version of events. But this time, I was armed with something I'd never had before: legal documentation and professional support for my version of the truth. "Aunt Sarah, I understand why you might be concerned, but I need you to know that everything I've said about Mom is documented and true. I have bank records, legal papers, evidence that she's been stealing from me for years. But honey, the things she showed me. You called her a narcissist. You said terrible things about how she raised you. That doesn't sound like the Zoe I know. Those were private conversations taken out of context from my personal accounts. The fact that she broke into my apartment to steal them should tell you everything you need to know about who we're really dealing with here." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "She said you might say something like that you've become paranoid and suspicious, that you see conspiracies everywhere." The brilliance of Patricia's strategy was becoming clear. By sharing my private thoughts and feelings, she'd made me look unstable while simultaneously positioning herself as the victim of my false accusations. Anyone who questioned her narrative could be dismissed as being manipulated by my paranoid delusions. I ended the call feeling more isolated than ever. Patricia had effectively weaponized my own family against me, using my private thoughts and feelings as evidence of my unfitness as a daughter. But the worst was yet to come. The next morning, I woke up to find my social media accounts flooded with comments and messages from people I barely knew. Somehow, Patricia had managed to make my private therapy notes and personal messages public, posting them on neighborhood forums and local Facebook groups with commentary about troubled young women and family destruction. The posts were carefully crafted to maximize damage while maintaining Patricia's plausible deniability. She didn't use my name directly, but provided enough identifying details that anyone who knew me would recognize the story. She painted herself as a concerned mother, reaching out to the community for advice about her mentally unstable daughter, who was making false accusations and destroying the family. The comments were brutal. Strangers offering armchair psychological diagnoses. Neighbors expressing shock at my ungrateful behavior. Acquaintances questioning whether I was fit to be married if I couldn't maintain a healthy relationship with my own mother. Brandon found me sitting on my bathroom floor at 10 in the morning, scrolling through comment after comment, each one feeling like a small knife wound to my sense of self. "Stop reading," he said gently, taking my phone away. "Stop giving her this power over you." "Everyone thinks I'm crazy," I whispered. "She's turned the entire town against me. The people who matter know the truth. Everyone else is just noise." But even as Brandon tried to comfort me, I could see the strain in his face. This wasn't what he'd signed up for when he'd proposed. He'd expected to marry me, not to become collateral damage in a war between me and my mother. "Maybe we should postpone the wedding," I said, the words tasting like ashes in my mouth. "Maybe we should wait until this is all resolved." Brandon was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, I heard everything I was afraid of. The doubt. The question of whether our love was strong enough to withstand this level of chaos and manipulation. "Is that what you want?" he asked finally. I thought about it honestly. The wedding that was supposed to be a celebration of our love had become a battlefield. Patricia had successfully turned what should have been the happiest time in my life into a source of stress and conflict. "I want to marry you," I said slowly. "But I don't want our wedding day to be overshadowed by whatever she might do next." Brandon nodded thoughtfully. "What if we changed the plan? What if we had a small ceremony, just immediate family and close friends, somewhere she doesn't know about?" The idea had merit, but it also felt like letting Patricia win. She'd successfully forced us to scale back our dreams, to hide our happiness, to plan our future around her capacity for destruction. "I don't want to give her that power," I said. "I don't want to let her steal this from us the way she's stolen everything else." Then we fight back, but we fight smart. That afternoon, we went to see Carmen, my wedding planner, to discuss security options for the ceremony. Carmen had been in the business long enough to have handled her share of family drama, but even she seemed taken aback by the level of vindictiveness we were dealing with. "I've seen mothers who disagree with their daughters' choices," she said as we sat in her office, overlooking the Riverside Country Club's manicured grounds. "I've dealt with divorced parents who can't be in the same room, even estranged siblings who try to sabotage each other's events. But what you're describing, this is something else entirely." Carmen pulled out a thick folder of security protocols and vendor agreements. "We can hire professional security, limit access to the venue, require identification for anyone claiming to be involved with the wedding. But honestly, Zoe, if your mother is determined to cause problems, there's only so much we can do to stop her." I stared out the window at the garden where Brandon and I had planned to exchange vows, wondering if Patricia had already found a way to poison that space for us too. "There is one option," Carmen said hesitantly. "It's not ideal, but it might be the safest approach given what you're dealing with." "What?" "We could plan 2 ceremonies. A decoy event at the original venue with limited guest list and security, and the real wedding somewhere else entirely. If your mother shows up to cause trouble, she'll be disrupting an empty event while you're actually getting married in peace." The suggestion was both clever and heartbreaking. The fact that we were discussing elaborate security measures and decoy weddings to protect ourselves from my own mother felt like a new low in an already devastating situation. But as we talked through the logistics, I realized Carmen's plan had potential. We could keep the original date and venue for a small family gathering, maybe just immediate relatives who we knew we could trust. Meanwhile, the real ceremony could happen the day before, at a location Patricia knew nothing about, with only our closest friends and Brandon's family. "It feels like we're letting her win," I said as we drove home from Carmen's office. "No," Brandon replied firmly. "Letting her win would be calling off the wedding entirely, letting her destroy our happiness. This is just strategy. We're not giving up, we're adapting." That evening, I called Diane to update her on the latest developments and discuss the wedding security plan. Her response was immediate and alarming. "Zoe, you need to take these threats very seriously. The escalation pattern your mother is showing is consistent with someone who's becoming increasingly desperate and potentially dangerous. Breaking into your apartment, stealing personal information, launching a public character assassination campaign, These are not the actions of someone who's going to respect boundaries or legal orders. Are you saying you think she might try to physically disrupt the wedding? I'm saying she's already shown she's willing to break the law to maintain control over you. A restraining order might not be enough to stop someone who's this committed to destroying your reputation and relationships. Diane's concerns were echoed the next day when Detective Maria Santos from the Cedar Falls Police Department called to follow up on my burglary report. Detective Santos was everything the initial responding officer hadn't been: thorough, professional, and clearly experienced in domestic violence cases. "I've reviewed your complaint and the documentation provided by your attorney," she said as we sat in the police station's interview room. "What you're describing fits a pattern we see in escalating domestic abuse cases. The fact that this involves a parent-child relationship doesn't make it any less serious." Detective Santos explained that the combination of financial fraud, harassment, breaking and entering, and public character assassination created a clear pattern of escalating abuse. These cases can become dangerous very quickly, especially when the abuser feels like they're losing control. "What can the police do to protect me?" "We can increase patrols in your neighborhood, flag your address for priority response, and most importantly, we can document everything that's happening. If your mother violates the restraining order or escalates to physical threats, we'll have a comprehensive record of her behavior pattern." The conversation was both reassuring and terrifying. On one hand, it felt validating to have law enforcement take my concerns seriously. On the other hand, the implication that this might escalate to physical danger was something I'd never truly considered. As I left the police station, I realized that Patricia had successfully transformed my wedding planning from a joyful celebration into a security operation. Instead of choosing flowers and finalizing seating charts, I was hiring bodyguards and planning decoy ceremonies. But she'd also made a crucial miscalculation. In her desperation to destroy my credibility and isolate me from support, she'd actually strengthened my case and given law enforcement a clear picture of her dangerous behavior patterns. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for Friday, just 10 days before our original wedding date. As I prepared for what I hoped would be the final legal confrontation, I realized that Patricia had inadvertently given me the most important wedding gift possible: absolute clarity about who she really was and what our relationship had always been. I was no longer fighting for my inheritance or my wedding dress. I was fighting for my right to exist free from manipulation, control, and abuse. And for the first time in my life, I felt strong enough to win that fight. The morning of the restraining order hearing, I woke up to find Patricia standing in my kitchen. She was calmly making coffee in the pre-dawn darkness, moving through my space with the casual familiarity of someone who belonged there. The sound of the coffee maker gurgling to life had pulled me from restless sleep, and for a moment I thought Brandon had gotten up early. But when I padded to the kitchen in my pajamas, expecting to find my fiancé, I instead found my mother humming softly as she arranged 2 mugs on the counter. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said without turning around, her voice carrying that artificially sweet tone she used when she was about to deliver a devastating blow. "I thought we should have one last conversation before you make the biggest mistake of your life." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. "How did you get in here?" "I've always had a key to this place. I co-signed your lease application, remember? I kept a copy for emergencies." She turned to face me then, and I was struck by how composed she looked. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her clothing immaculate. She looked like a woman in complete control, not someone facing a restraining order hearing in 3 hours. "This is breaking and entering. You're violating the temporary order." Patricia laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. "What temporary order? I haven't been served with anything yet. Technically, I'm just a concerned mother checking on her daughter before a difficult day in court." I reached for my phone to call the police, but Patricia's voice stopped me cold. "I wouldn't do that if I were you. Not unless you want Brandon to see some very interesting photographs." She pulled out her own phone and showed me the screen. There, in high-resolution clarity, were photos of me and my ex-boyfriend Marcus, taken during a weekend trip we'd taken to Portland 3 years ago. The images were intimate, private moments that had been captured during what I'd thought was a romantic getaway. At the time, I'd had no idea Marcus was photographing our personal moments, much less sharing them with anyone. "Where did you get these?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Marcus was more than happy to share when I explained the situation. Poor boy, he's still quite bitter about how things ended between you two. He had so many interesting stories to tell about your relationship, your habits, your little insecurities, all documented with such artistic flair. The room began to spin as the implications hit me. Patricia had tracked down my ex-boyfriend, convinced him to share private, intimate images of me, and was now using them as leverage to control my behavior. "You can't do this. This is revenge porn, it's illegal." "Is it?" "I'm not distributing anything publicly. I'm simply showing my future son-in-law what kind of woman he's planning to marry." "Don't you think he has a right to know about your past? About the kind of relationships you're capable of sustaining?" Patricia moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call your lawyer and withdraw the restraining order petition. You're going to drop the lawsuit about the estate. And you're going to accept that some people are just better at managing money and relationships than others. And if you don't, these photos find their way to Brandon's inbox, to your boss at Crawford Architecture, to everyone on your wedding guest list. I'll make sure the whole town knows exactly what kind of woman their sweet little Zoe really is." I stared at her, trying to process the sheer calculated cruelty of what she was proposing. She'd somehow obtained intimate images of me without my knowledge or consent, and was now threatening to destroy my relationship, my career, and my reputation, unless I surrendered completely to her control. "You're my mother," I said, the words coming out cracked and broken. "You're supposed to protect me, not destroy me." Patricia's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something cold and empty in her eyes. "I am protecting you. I'm protecting you from making decisions you're not equipped to handle. I'm protecting this family from the embarrassment of having our private business aired in public. And I'm protecting Brandon from marrying someone who clearly doesn't understand the meaning of loyalty." The coffee maker beeped, signaling that the brew cycle was complete. Patricia poured 2 cups with steady hands, adding cream and sugar to mine exactly the way I liked it, a gesture so maternal and nurturing that it made the entire situation feel even more surreal. "You have until noon to make your decision," she said, sliding the mug across the counter toward me. "The hearing is at 10. That gives you 2 hours after you lose in court to call Diane and start fixing this mess you've created." "I'm not going to lose." Patricia's smile was patient, indulgent, the way you might smile at a child who insisted that monsters weren't real. "Oh, honey, you have no idea what losing looks like yet." She left through the front door, walking out as casually as if she'd just stopped by for a neighborly chat. I stood frozen in my kitchen, holding a cup of coffee that tasted like ashes, trying to understand how my life had spiraled so completely out of control. When Brandon emerged from the bedroom 20 minutes later, I was still standing in the same spot, staring at the space where Patricia had been. "You're up early?" he said, kissing my cheek as he reached for the coffee pot. "Nervous about today?" I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to show him Patricia's threats, explain about the photographs, ask for his help and support. But the shame was overwhelming. Those images represented a part of my past I'd never shared with Brandon, intimate moments with another man that I'd believed were private and consensual. The thought of him seeing them, of Patricia's poison infecting his perception of me, was unbearable. "Just couldn't sleep?" I managed to say. "Too much on my mind." Brandon studied my face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read my moods and anxieties. "Hey, whatever happens today, we'll get through it together. One more legal hurdle, and then we can focus on our wedding and our future." I nodded and smiled, but inside I was calculating. 2 hours after the hearing. That was Patricia's deadline. 2 hours to decide whether to surrender completely or risk having my most private moments weaponized against everyone I loved. The ride to the courthouse was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Diane met us at the security checkpoint. her expression confident and professional, clearly expecting another victory like the one we'd achieved in the asset hearing. "How are you feeling?" she asked as we walked toward the courtroom. "Terrified," I answered honestly. "That's normal. Restraining order hearings can be emotionally intense, especially when family is involved. But we have a strong case. The breaking and entering, the harassment campaign, the escalating behavior pattern, all of it supports our petition. I wanted to tell Diane about Patricia's morning visit, about the photographs and the ultimatum, but shame and fear kept the words locked in my throat. How could I explain that my own mother had obtained intimate images of me and was threatening to destroy my life with them? How could I admit that I might not have the courage to see this fight through to the end? Patricia was already seated in the courtroom when we arrived, flanked by her lawyer and what appeared to be a small army of character witnesses. I recognized some of them. My Aunt Sarah, my cousin Michael, several family friends who'd known me since childhood. They all looked somber and concerned, like people preparing to testify about a loved one's tragic mental decline. Judge Morrison called the hearing to order and reviewed the petition for a restraining order. Diane presented our case methodically, walking through the timeline of Patricia's escalating behavior, the theft of my wedding dress, the break-in at my apartment, the harassment campaign designed to isolate me from family and community support. Your Honor, the respondent has shown a clear pattern of escalating abusive behavior designed to control and intimidate the petitioner. The theft of personal property, the violation of private spaces, and the systematic character assassination campaign all indicate that the respondent poses a continuing threat to the petitioner's safety and well-being. Patricia's lawyer stood to present their defense, and I braced myself for another round of character assassination disguised as concern for my mental health. Your Honor, my client is a devoted mother who has watched her daughter spiral into increasingly erratic and paranoid behavior. The petitioner has made wild accusations about financial fraud, has sued her own mother based on delusions of theft, and has now escalated to seeking legal protection from the woman who raised her with nothing but love and sacrifice. One by one, Patricia's witnesses took the stand to testify about my alleged mental instability. Aunt Sarah spoke tearfully about how I'd changed over the past year, becoming suspicious and hostile toward family members who'd only tried to help. Cousin Michael described conversations where I'd made paranoid accusations about Patricia's handling of my grandmother's estate. A family friend testified that I'd always been emotionally fragile and suggested that the stress of wedding planning had pushed me into a complete breakdown. Each testimony felt like a knife wound, not just because of the lies being told, but because of who was telling them. These were people I'd loved and trusted, people who'd been at my birthday parties and graduation celebrations, people who'd known me since childhood. And they were all standing up in court to paint me as unstable and delusional. But the worst was yet to come. When it was Patricia's turn to testify, she took the stand with the dignity of a woman reluctantly forced to air her family's private pain in public. Her testimony was a masterclass in manipulation, painting herself as a loving mother driven to desperate measures by her daughter's deteriorating mental state. Your Honor, I've watched my daughter become increasingly paranoid and hostile over the past year. She's made wild accusations about me stealing from her, claimed that I broke into her apartment, even suggested that I somehow orchestrated problems with her employer. These delusions have become so severe that she's convinced herself I'm some kind of criminal mastermind plotting to destroy her life. Patricia's voice broke slightly as she continued, a perfect performance of maternal anguish. I've tried everything to help her. I've offered to pay for counseling, suggested she speak with our family doctor about anxiety medication, even offered to help with wedding expenses if financial stress was contributing to her problems. But instead of accepting help, she's become more withdrawn and suspicious. The judge listened with apparent sympathy as Patricia described her version of recent events. In her telling, the missing wedding dress was the result of my own confusion and stress-induced memory problems. The break-in at my apartment was either imagined or staged to support my persecution delusions. The evidence I presented of financial fraud was the product of my inability to understand complex estate management. I'm not asking this court to dismiss my daughter's concerns, Patricia concluded. I'm asking for the opportunity to get her the help she clearly needs without the interference of legal proceedings that are only feeding her paranoid delusions. When Diane cross-examined Patricia, she attacked the inconsistencies in her testimony with surgical precision. But Patricia was prepared for every question, having spent years perfecting her ability to twist reality to serve her narrative. Ms. Hartwell, you testified that you've never been in your daughter's apartment without permission. How do you explain the handwritten note that was found there after the break-in? I've never seen that note before. It's possible my daughter wrote it herself to support her belief that I'm harassing her. The handwriting analysis clearly shows. Handwriting analysis can be manipulated by someone determined to prove a point they've already decided is true. It went on like that for an hour, Patricia deflecting every piece of evidence with explanations that made me sound increasingly unstable and desperate. She'd had years to perfect this strategy, and it showed. When the judge called for a recess, I followed Diane into the hallway with growing dread. How bad is it? I asked. Diane's expression was troubled. She's good. Better than I expected. The character witnesses, the alternative explanations for everything, the way she's positioned herself as the concerned mother trying to help her troubled daughter, it's very convincing. But we have evidence. Bank records, security footage from the bridal shop, the police report from the break-in. Evidence can be interpreted many different ways. And unfortunately, your mother has done an excellent job of creating an alternative narrative that explains all of that evidence as either coincidence or the product of your mental state. I felt the walls closing in as the full scope of Patricia's strategy became clear. She hadn't just been trying to win this hearing, she'd been building toward it for months. Every interaction, every witness, every piece of testimony had been carefully orchestrated to support her version of reality. When court reconvened, it was my turn to testify. I took the stand, knowing that this might be my only chance to tell the truth in a forum where it mattered. I walked through the timeline of Patricia's behavior. From the theft of my inheritance, to the break-in at my apartment, to the harassment campaign that had isolated me from family and community. But even as I spoke, I could see the doubt in Judge Morrison's eyes. Patricia had done her job well, painting me as an unreliable narrator whose perceptions couldn't be trusted. Every piece of evidence I presented could be explained away as confusion, delusion, or outright fabrication. Patricia's lawyer's cross-examination was brutal but effective. He focused on my history of what he termed relationship instability, my brief period of therapy, my admitted stress about wedding planning. He painted a picture of a woman whose grip on reality had been tenuous for years and had finally snapped under pressure. Ms. Hartwell, isn't it true that you've struggled with anxiety and depression? I sought therapy briefly to deal with family stress, yes. And isn't it true that your therapist recommended medication for paranoid ideation? That's taking things out of context. I have your therapy notes here, obtained from your own apartment. Would you like me to read the section where your therapist expresses concern about your tendency toward conspiracy thinking and, quote, difficulty maintaining perspective on family relationships? I realized with growing horror that Patricia had not only stolen my therapy notes, she'd shared them with her lawyer to be used as weapons against me in court. The private thoughts and struggles I'd shared in the safety of a therapeutic relationship were being twisted into evidence of my mental instability. By the time I stepped down from the witness stand, I knew I'd lost. Patricia's campaign had been too thorough, too well orchestrated. She'd successfully convinced the court that I was an unstable woman making false accusations against my loving, concerned mother. Judge Morrison delivered her ruling with the tone of someone making a difficult but necessary decision. While I'm sympathetic to the petitioner's concerns, the evidence presented does not support the issuance of a restraining order. The respondent's testimony and character witnesses present a compelling alternative explanation for the events in question. It appears that the petitioner may be experiencing stress-related mental health issues that are affecting her perception of family interactions. The gavel came down like a death sentence. I had lost, completely and utterly. Worse, the court's rejection of my petition had given Patricia's version of events an official stamp of approval. According to the legal system, I was an unstable woman making false accusations against my innocent mother. As people filed out of the courtroom, Patricia caught my eye and mouthed a single word: noon. 2 hours to surrender or face the consequences of her nuclear option. I sat in Diane's office afterward, staring at the legal documents that had failed to protect me, trying to process the magnitude of my defeat. Diane was clearly shaken by the outcome, reviewing her notes and case files as if she could find some overlooked detail that might change everything. "I'm sorry, Zoe. I really thought we had a strong case. The evidence was solid, the behavior pattern was clear." "She's just better at this than we are," I said quietly. "She's had 30 years to perfect the art of making me look crazy while she looks reasonable." Brandon sat beside me in stunned silence. The confident, supportive partner who'd encouraged me to fight back was confronting the reality that sometimes the legal system couldn't protect people from sophisticated manipulation. "What happens now?" he asked. I looked at the clock on Diane's wall. 11:45. 15 minutes until Patricia's deadline. 15 minutes to decide whether to surrender completely or risk having my most intimate moments used as weapons against everyone I loved. Now I have to decide whether to keep fighting or accept that she's won. But even as I said the words, I realized that Patricia had made a critical miscalculation. She'd assumed that shame and fear would be enough to break me, that the threat of exposure would force me to surrender. She'd assumed that I was still the frightened, compliant daughter who'd spent years accepting her version of reality. What she didn't know was that losing in court had clarified something important for me. This wasn't about inheritance money or wedding dresses or even family relationships anymore. This was about whether I was going to spend the rest of my life being controlled by someone who viewed my happiness as a threat to her power. At exactly noon, my phone rang. Patricia's name appeared on the screen, and I knew this was the moment of truth. I could answer and negotiate my surrender, or I could let it ring and face whatever consequences she'd prepared. I looked at Brandon, at Diane, at the legal documents scattered across the desk that represented my failed attempt to fight back through official channels. Then I did something that surprised everyone in the room, including myself. I answered the phone and put it on speaker. "Hello, Mother." "Well, have you made your decision?" "I have. I've decided to call your bluff." The silence on the other end was telling. Patricia had been so confident in her leverage, so certain that shame and fear would control me, that she hadn't prepared for outright defiance. "You don't understand what you're risking," she said finally. "I understand perfectly. You're threatening to humiliate me publicly, to destroy my relationships, to use intimate images as weapons against me. And I'm telling you to go ahead and try." "Zoe." "No, you listen to me. For 30 years, you've controlled me by making me afraid of what other people might think. Afraid of disappointment. Afraid of conflict. But I'm not afraid anymore. You want to share those photographs? Fine. I'll explain to everyone exactly how you obtained them and why you're using them. You want to destroy my relationship with Brandon? He's sitting right here listening to this conversation, and he can make his own decisions about who I am based on what I do, not on what you threatened to reveal about my past." I could hear Patricia's breathing on the other end, quick and shallow, the sound of someone whose carefully constructed plan was falling apart in real time. "You're making a mistake," she said, but her voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "The only mistake I made was believing that you might actually be capable of acting like a mother instead of a predator. But that mistake ends today." I hung up without waiting for her response, my heart pounding with adrenaline and something I hadn't felt in years. Complete, uncompromising freedom. Brandon stared at me with an expression of awe and concern. "Are you sure about this? If she follows through on her threats, then we'll deal with it together. But I'm done letting fear make my decisions for me." Diane was frantically taking notes, clearly recalibrating her legal strategy based on this new development. If she does distribute those images, that's a clear criminal act. Revenge porn laws in Oregon are very strict. We could have her arrested. I nodded, but I was already thinking beyond Patricia's immediate threats. The restraining order hearing had shown me something important. The legal system couldn't protect me from someone as skilled at manipulation as my mother. But it had also shown me that I didn't need protection anymore. I just needed the courage to stop running from her. "There's something else," I said, pulling out my own phone. "Something I found when I was going through the documents she stole from my apartment." I showed them a photograph that Marcus had sent me years ago, one I'd completely forgotten about until Patricia's threats had jogged my memory. It was an image of Patricia herself, taken during one of her visits to Portland when Marcus and I were dating. She was clearly intoxicated, behaving in ways that were deeply embarrassing and completely at odds with the dignified, concerned mother persona she'd presented in court. She was so focused on collecting ammunition against me that she forgot I might have some ammunition of my own, I said. Marcus wasn't just documenting my private moments. He was documenting everything. Diane's smile was sharp and satisfied. Now that changes everything. As we began planning our counterattack, I realized that Patricia had inadvertently given me the most valuable gift possible: absolute clarity about who she was and what our relationship had always been. The loving mother, the concerned parent, the family protector. It had all been an elaborate performance designed to maintain control, but performances require an audience, and I was no longer willing to watch. Patricia's retaliation came swiftly and predictably. Within 3 hours of our phone conversation, intimate photographs of me began appearing on social media platforms, neighborhood forums, and in email inboxes throughout Cedar Falls. She'd followed through on her threat with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent years planning this nuclear option. But what Patricia hadn't anticipated was my response. Instead of hiding, instead of scrambling to contain the damage or begging her to stop, I did something that caught everyone off guard. I called a press conference. Carmen, my wedding planner, had connections with the local media through her work with high-profile events. Within 2 hours, I was standing in front of the Riverside Country Club, facing 3 news cameras and a small crowd of reporters, ready to tell my story in full. "My name is Zoe Hartwell," I began, my voice steady despite the chaos of the morning. "You've probably seen intimate images of me circulating online today. Those images were distributed without my consent by my own mother as retaliation for my decision to pursue legal action against her for financial fraud." The reporters leaned forward, clearly not expecting this level of directness about such a personal violation. "I'm holding this press conference because I refuse to be ashamed of being victimized. I refuse to hide while someone who should have protected me uses my private moments as weapons. And I refuse to let other victims of family abuse think they have to suffer in silence." I pulled out a thick folder of documents, the same evidence that had failed to persuade the family court but would prove devastatingly effective in the court of public opinion. For 3 years, my mother has been living in a house worth $480,000 that legally belongs to both of us. She's been using investment funds totaling over $300,000 that were left to me by my grandmother. When I discovered this theft and began legal proceedings to recover my inheritance, she escalated to harassment, breaking and entering, and now revenge porn. I handed copies of bank records, property deeds, and estate documents to the assembled reporters. Everything I'm telling you is documented. The financial fraud, the systematic harassment, the pattern of escalating abuse. This isn't a family dispute about wedding planning or generational differences. This is a criminal pattern of behavior by someone who views my independence as a threat to her control. The questions came fast and sharp, and I answered each one with the calm precision of someone who'd finally stopped running from the truth. "Ms. Hartwell, why didn't you go to the police instead of holding a press conference?" "I did go to the police. I filed reports, sought restraining orders, followed every legal avenue available. But family abuse, especially financial abuse, is notoriously difficult to prosecute. The legal system often treats these cases as civil disputes rather than criminal behavior. What do you hope to accomplish by going public?" "I want other victims to know they're not alone. I want them to understand that family abuse is still abuse, regardless of the relationship involved. And I want my mother to face the same public scrutiny she's tried to subject me to." "How has this affected your upcoming wedding?" For the first time, my composure cracked slightly. "My mother stole my wedding dress 6 weeks before my ceremony. She's systematically tried to sabotage the most important day of my life as punishment for standing up to her. But Brandon and I are still getting married because we refuse to let her steal our happiness along with everything else." The press conference lasted 45 minutes, and by the time it ended, my phone was buzzing with messages from reporters, advocacy organizations, and strangers offering support. But more importantly, the narrative had shifted. Instead of being the unstable daughter making false accusations against her loving mother, I was now a domestic abuse survivor, speaking truth to power. The local news coverage that evening was devastating for Patricia. Channel 7 led with the headline, "Local Woman Exposes Mother's Financial Fraud and Revenge Porn Campaign." Channel 12 featured an interview with a domestic violence expert who explained the patterns of family financial abuse. Even the Cedar Falls Gazette ran a front-page story with the headline, "When Family Becomes Predator, a Daughter's Fight for Justice." But the real turning point came when Marcus reached out. I was sitting in Brandon's apartment that evening, watching the news coverage with a mixture of vindication and exhaustion, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Zoe, this is Marcus. I saw the news. I need to talk to you." My first instinct was to hang up. Marcus had provided Patricia with the ammunition she'd used against me, and I wasn't interested in hearing his excuses or apologies. "I don't have anything to say to you," I said. "Please, just listen for a minute. I need you to know that I never gave your mother those photographs willingly." That stopped me cold. "What do you mean?" "She showed up at my apartment 3 weeks ago with a lawyer and some kind of legal document. She claimed you'd signed a release allowing her to collect evidence for a mental competency hearing. She said you were having a breakdown, and your family was trying to protect you from making decisions you weren't capable of making." I felt Brandon tense beside me as he heard Marcus's explanation. "I thought I was helping," Marcus continued, his voice thick with regret. "She seemed so concerned, so professional. She had official-looking paperwork, she knew details about your life, that suggested you'd given her permission to reach out to me. I never imagined she was planning to use those images against you. Do you still have copies of the documents she showed you? I took pictures of them before she left. I thought they looked legitimate at the time, but after seeing the news today, I think they were forgeries. Professional forgeries." My mind raced with the implications. If Marcus was telling the truth, it meant Patricia had not only committed revenge porn, but had also engaged in fraud and identity theft to obtain the images in the first place. "Marcus, I need you to send me those documents, and I need you to be willing to testify about what really happened when my mother contacted you. Whatever you need. I'm so sorry, Zoe. I had no idea I was being used to hurt you." 20 minutes later, my phone chimed with images of the forged documents Patricia had used to manipulate Marcus. They were masterfully crafted, complete with fake letterhead, official-looking seals, and my forged signature authorizing the release of private materials for a competency evaluation. I immediately forwarded everything to Detective Santos and Diane, along with a detailed explanation of Marcus's story. The response was swift and decisive. "This changes everything," Diane said when she called an hour later. "Identity theft, fraud, obtaining private images under false pretenses, revenge porn distribution. We're not talking about civil remedies anymore. This is serious criminal behavior with multiple felony charges." Detective Santos was even more direct when she arrived at Brandon's apartment an hour later with an arrest warrant. "Based on the evidence you've provided and the witness testimony from Marcus Chen, we have sufficient probable cause to arrest Patricia Hartwell on charges of identity theft, fraud, harassment, and distribution of intimate images without consent." As Detective Santos explained the charges, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just hope for legal vindication, but hope that other victims might see this case and find the courage to speak up about their own experiences with family abuse. The arrest happened at 6 the next morning. I wasn't there to witness it, but the news coverage showed Patricia being led from the family estate in handcuffs, her carefully constructed facade finally cracking under the weight of criminal charges. The woman who'd spent years presenting herself as a respectable pillar of the community was now facing potential prison time for the systematic abuse of her own daughter. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of multiple felony convictions, Patricia's lawyer advised her to accept a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to fraud, identity theft, and distribution of intimate images without consent, receiving a sentence of 18 months in prison with additional restitution requirements. But the most satisfying moment came during the victim impact statement portion of her sentencing hearing. I stood before Judge Morrison, the same judge who denied my restraining order petition, and spoke directly to Patricia for what I knew would be the last time. For 30 years, you taught me that love was conditional, that approval had to be earned through submission, that my worth was determined by your perception of my value. You used my love for you as a weapon against me, exploiting my desire for maternal affection to control and manipulate every aspect of my life. Patricia sat at the defendant's table, no longer the polished, dignified woman who'd testified about her troubled daughter. The orange jumpsuit and handcuffs had stripped away her carefully constructed persona, revealing the desperate, controlling person she'd always been underneath. You stole my inheritance, my wedding dress, my private moments, my reputation, and nearly my sanity. But you couldn't steal the most important thing, my sense of self-worth. That had to be given freely, and I'm no longer willing to give it to someone who's proven incapable of cherishing it. I paused, looking directly into her eyes for the first time in months. I forgive you, not because you've asked for forgiveness or shown remorse, but because carrying anger toward you was poisoning my ability to build the life I deserve. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending this didn't happen. It means I'm choosing to move forward without the weight of your dysfunction dragging me down. Patricia's face remained impassive throughout my statement, but I saw something flicker in her eyes when I mentioned forgiveness. Perhaps surprise that I wasn't seeking revenge. Perhaps disappointment that she could no longer provoke the emotional reactions she'd once been able to manipulate so easily. I hope you use your time in prison to reflect on the choices that brought you here. I hope you eventually understand that love isn't about control, that family relationships aren't about power dynamics, that a mother's job is to prepare her children for independence, not to sabotage their attempts to build autonomous lives. As I walked away from the podium, I felt lighter than I had in years. The legal victory was satisfying, but the personal victory was transformative. I was no longer Patricia's victim, no longer her daughter in any meaningful sense, no longer trapped in the destructive dynamic that had defined our relationship for 3 decades. Brandon and I were married 3 days later in a small ceremony at the Riverside Country Club, surrounded by friends who'd stood by us through the chaos and family members who'd learned to see past Patricia's manipulations. Carmen had outdone herself, creating a celebration that felt both intimate and joyful, a perfect beginning to our life together. I wore a dress I'd found at a small boutique in Portland, a simple but elegant gown that represented my own choices, rather than anyone else's expectations. As I walked down the aisle toward Brandon, I carried a bouquet of my grandmother's roses, a symbol of the love and strength that had sustained me through the darkest period of my life. The ceremony was everything our original wedding was supposed to be, a celebration of love, commitment, and the courage to build something beautiful, despite the obstacles placed in our path. When Brandon and I exchanged vows, I spoke about the difference between the family you're born into and the family you choose, about the importance of surrounding yourself with people who celebrate your growth rather than fearing your independence. You taught me that love should feel like freedom, not captivity, I said to Brandon as we stood before our chosen family. You showed me that healthy relationships are built on trust and respect, not control and manipulation. You helped me understand that I deserve to be loved for who I am, not for how well I conform to someone else's expectations. The reception was small but perfect, filled with laughter, dancing, and the kind of joy that comes from surviving something terrible and choosing happiness anyway. As Brandon and I shared our first dance as husband and wife, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment, the theft that had revealed the truth, the legal battle that had tested our resolve, the moment I'd chosen courage over fear. 6 months later, I received a letter from Patricia. It was forwarded through Diane's office, per the no-contact order that was part of her plea agreement. The envelope sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I found the courage to open it. The letter was 2 pages long, written in Patricia's familiar handwriting, and it contained something I'd never expected to receive: a genuine apology. Zoe, it began, I've spent the last 6 months in therapy, court-mandated but surprisingly helpful, trying to understand how I became the kind of person who would steal from her own daughter and distribute intimate images as revenge. I won't insult you by claiming I didn't know what I was doing was wrong. I knew. I chose to do it anyway because I was more committed to maintaining control than to preserving our relationship. The letter went on to acknowledge specific harms, to take responsibility without making excuses, and to express genuine remorse for the pain she'd caused. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase 30 years of manipulation and abuse, but it was honest in a way Patricia had never been before. I don't expect forgiveness, the letter concluded. I don't expect reconciliation. I understand that the damage I've done to our relationship is irreparable. But I want you to know that you were right to fight back. Right to expose my behavior. Right to protect yourself from someone who claimed to love you while actively trying to destroy your happiness. I'm proud of your strength, even though I have no right to claim any credit for it. I read the letter twice, then filed it away with all the other legal documents from our case. It was closure of a sort, but not the kind that required any response or action from me. Patricia had acknowledged the truth, but that acknowledgement was for her benefit, not mine. I'd already moved on. The house on Willowbrook Lane, my grandmother's Victorian estate, was sold as part of Patricia's restitution payments. Brandon and I used our portion of the proceeds as a down payment on a small craftsman bungalow on the other side of town, a house with good bones and a garden where we could plant our own roses. We hosted our first Thanksgiving in that house, surrounded by Brandon's family and the friends who'd become our chosen family. As I stood in our kitchen, preparing dinner for people who loved us without conditions or expectations, I thought about the woman I'd been a year earlier. Scared, controlled, accepting less than I deserved, because I'd been taught that asking for more was selfish. That woman felt like a stranger now. The final legal resolution came 8 months after Patricia's sentencing, when the civil court awarded me full ownership of my grandmother's estate and additional damages for the years of financial fraud. The money was significant, but more important was the official acknowledgement that I'd been right all along, that my perceptions hadn't been delusional, that the abuse I'd suffered had been real and systematic. I used part of the settlement to establish a legal aid fund for other victims of family financial abuse, working with domestic violence organizations to provide resources for people trapped in similar situations. The fund helps survivors access legal representation, financial counseling, and therapeutic support as they work to rebuild their lives free from family-based control and manipulation. The work has been personally healing, allowing me to transform my experience from a source of pain into a tool for helping others. I speak at conferences about family financial abuse, sharing my story, and educating professionals about the warning signs and intervention strategies that can help other victims. 6 months ago, I received a call from a young woman named Emily, whose mother had been systematically stealing from her trust fund, while convincing the family that Emily was too unstable to manage her own finances. Emily had seen one of my speaking engagements and found the courage to seek legal help. I kept thinking I was crazy, Emily told me during our first conversation. She made everything seem so reasonable, so protective. But when I heard your story, I realized that protection doesn't feel like control, and love doesn't require submission. Emily's case is still ongoing, but she's already reclaimed her sense of reality and begun building the support system she needs to break free from her mother's manipulation. Watching her journey has reminded me of how far I've traveled from the woman who once picked up pieces of her torn resume from a conference room trash can. Brandon and I are expecting our first child next spring. As I watch my body change and think about the tiny person growing inside me, I'm filled with determination to break the generational cycle of manipulation and control that defined my relationship with Patricia. This child will be raised with unconditional love, will be encouraged toward independence rather than dependence, will learn that healthy relationships are built on respect rather than fear. Sometimes people ask if I regret pursuing legal action against Patricia, if I wish I'd found a way to preserve our family relationship despite her behavior. The question always surprises me because it assumes that what we had was worth preserving, that toxicity disguised as love is better than no relationship at all. But I know now that some relationships can't be fixed, can only be survived. Some family ties need to be cut for everyone's health and safety. Some mothers are incapable of putting their children's well-being ahead of their own need for control. I don't regret standing up to Patricia. I don't regret exposing her behavior, or pursuing criminal charges, or speaking publicly about family abuse. I regret only that it took me 30 years to find the courage to demand better for myself. The wedding dress Patricia stole was never recovered. Somewhere in Cedar Falls, It's probably hanging in a stranger's closet. Or perhaps it was resold again to another bride who has no idea of its history. But I'm glad it's gone. That dress represented the woman I used to be, the one who accepted less than she deserved, because she'd been taught that wanting more was selfish. The dress I wore to marry Brandon represented the woman I'd become, someone who knew her worth, who surrounded herself with people who celebrated her growth, who refused to accept love that came with conditions and control. As I sit in my garden this evening, watching the roses Brandon and I planted together bloom in the late afternoon sun, I think about my grandmother's words about beautiful things surviving even when everything else falls apart. She was right, but not in the way I once thought. The beautiful thing that survived wasn't the house or the inheritance or even the family relationships. It was my sense of self, my capacity for joy, my belief that I deserved to be loved without conditions. Those things had been buried under years of manipulation and control, but they hadn't been destroyed. They'd been waiting for me to find the courage to dig them up and plant them somewhere they could finally grow. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.